Welcome, everybody. My name is Mikey Mhenna. I'm honored to have our special guest, Nora Boustany, for today's afikra conversation. It's nice to see you all here. It's my honor to welcome our special guest. Nora Boustany is an award-winning correspondent and columnist who has covered Lebanon's war, Desert Storm, and upheavals in Gaza and Algeria, among many others. A triple nominee for the Pulitzer Prize and a one-time finalist for her coverage of the Lebanon War. She worked for the Washington Post for 30 years. Her special focus on the suffering of civilians in conflict, the disintegration of communities, and the plight of refugees guided her reporting throughout and has won several awards, including the George Polk Award for Foreign Reporting, the Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi Award, and the Bronze Medal for Foreign Correspondents. She now teaches journalism at the AUB in Lebanon, hoping to form future journalists and to train them to defend the truth, scrutinize those in power with determination, curiosity, and professionalism, and to give a voice to the voiceless, drawing on her own experience. Nora, welcome to afikra Conversations.
Thank you for the opportunity to reach out and connect with people.
It is our pleasure to have you. Nora, so you are calling us from Beirut, and you grew up in Beirut. So just to give us context about your own perspective, I'd love to hear what your relationship was with the city and with the country in the 1960s before you left to pursue your master's.
Growing up in Beirut at that time, I was born in the early 50s, but growing up in the late 50s, 60s, kind of coming of age in the 70s was magical. Ras Beirut was this cosmopolitan, elegant place where as kids, we went bowling on Saturdays, or we went to the Hamra cinema matinees where there were clowns and popcorn and 7-Up were served. And we got to watch Mickey Mouse and Tweety the bird and Casper the friendly ghost. And on Hamra Street were the most elegant shops where we would go, window shopping. And I think that the nicest expression is in French. It's called lèche vitrine, where we'd literally almost lick the fronts of stores. Elegant shoe shops, our favorite toy store, Toylands, Bawarshis, where we bought our school supplies. And the center of our world was our ballet school, which was a little bit up the street from Hamra. So this is where it was happening. This is where all the movie theaters were, where our first dates were, and where we walked. Eventually, we lived on Sadat at the end of Hamra, and we'd walk to our ballet classes and to the shops. And this is where we kind of empowered ourselves with this free Mediterranean style kind of independence and freedom of thought.
So this is where you grew up. You were sort of surrounded with this intellectual curiosity, but you weren't particularly interested in being a journalist as a kid. What did you think you wanted to do?
I was a born storyteller, and I was considered funny by my family and kind of a comedian who imitated people. And growing up, my sister and I went to a German school, and we did well there. And one of my art teachers once put me aside with my twin, and she said, I think we were about 14 at the time. She said, I think your future lies in translating cultures, in interpreting your world to others. And she was prophetic. May she rest in peace, Fräulein Eva Maria Laudin. And when I then went to college, I studied the sciences, Sciences X, and it was assumed we would go into medicine. My dad was a doctor. My twin became a physician, but I kind of chafed at the idea of organic chemistry, and I made it clear my father knew that this was not in the cards. And I really wanted to go into architecture. And my father and uncle, who was an engineer, were opposed to it. And we sat around the dinner table discussing it ad nauseum. And the idea of mass communication and journalism came up. And my parents thought it would be a good fit for my personality and kind of artistic leanings. And that's the way it went. You know, when I went to AUB to do my undergraduate degree in mass communications, you know, the joke was, yes, I'm going to become a chic correspondent and all that stuff. Of course, I never took it seriously. You lived from day to day. You know, you're 18, you're 19, you're going to parties, you're going to the beach. You're worrying about your ballet performance, about your boyfriends. And eventually I applied for grad schools. I did really well in mass communication. It was so easy after Sciences X. And I applied to 10 schools in the US, and I was accepted in all of them. And my choice finally fell on the University of Missouri, Columbia, which is the oldest school of journalism in the US and was one of the first good schools. And they gave me a partial scholarship. So wanting to be semi-independent, that's the one I chose. And of course, that was the beginning of my graduate studies, was in 1975, the year the war broke out in Lebanon. There had been spurts of violence until then, but it wasn't until I was on my own in the US, far away from home for the first time, and far away from my twin and my parents. And I was so focused on seeing Lebanon every night on Walter Cronkite, CBS News, seeing Lebanon go up in flames. And I wanted to understand it. I wasn't particularly political then, but I used to read a lot of news magazines. And I would go into the periodicals library every evening after my classes and read Le Monde in French. I would read An-Nahar, which used to come 5 days late, and the Christian Science Monitor, and whatever I could put my hands on. And I always felt there was some dimension that was missing in the coverage. I learned from reading all these articles, but I really wanted to be the one covering the story. You know, it was a feeling in my gut that this is what I should be doing. And I didn't really have a plan. Things were really bad in Lebanon. The airport was closed. I ended up doing my master's program of 2 years and 1.5 years because I couldn't come home.
Yeah.
And I applied for jobs in the US at the UN. Nothing really came through. And so I returned home.
So, no, I want to ask you a question about that. So you said, you know, this, I found this quote where you essentially said something really similar, saying, you know, I was reading all the coverage about the Arab world and something was missing. These people weren't writing for me. I felt like I should be the one writing.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you feel that you had a unique voice at the time, or did you feel like just a voice like yours had to be saying these stories?
I wanted to add that little something, that extra bit of humanity that was sometimes lacking. And, you know, as I found out much later, of course, there are structural constraints of space and time and access that don't always allow you to develop that. But I felt it was really missing. I mean, my childhood, the fairy tales my grandmother told us before we went to bed, there was that dimension that I was missing in the very detailed dispatches, but kind of dispassionate stories about the war in Lebanon. You know, it was about militias and battles and Syrians and troops and killing and violence and massacres. And of course that was going on, but I wanted to hear the voice of the people.
So you head back in 1976 and you become what is known to be a stringer. You know, you apply for all these jobs, and there's this quote of yours, my university degree, all these editors made it clear to you that your university degrees were worth nothing since you had no experience. And by the way, they didn't hire women to begin with. So did you know, can you explain to those listening, what is a stringer then and what is a stringer now?
The stringer now has much more power and has more rights that are protected by all these wonderful Committee for the Protection of Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, etc. When I started out, if you were a stringer, you had absolutely no rights. You were paid by word. We were paid a pittance. We had no health or security coverage. We had no I had no retainer. Basically, you were what you were able to produce if it was used on spec by the newspaper you were servicing at the time, which we always refer to as the beast. If you fed the beast and your story got published, the words used ended up determining how much money you made. But of course, I never thought about it in that way. My first approach to journalism was when I applied to United Press International. And I was told by this Welshman that when I told him I had a master's, that didn't count at all. What counted was my experience and my reporting chops and my ability to write. And so they put me on the night shift. I would work from 5, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning, and stumble home by service or taxi at that time, which infuriated my parents. But it was so exciting, kind of being in the eye of the storm and being the only one receiving the news and putting it out at night. Eventually, after making a big fuss, I would be able to do, every 3 weeks, I was able to do a day shift. And what I would do on my days off was I would try to write a feature. I would go to South Lebanon or write about how people feel about the bombing, how children were reacting to it. And the first time a story of mine at UPI got published by the International Herald Tribune, I got the feeling that, hey, I can do this. I belong with these foreign correspondents who go out on these, very heavily liquid lunches at these fancy restaurants and come back half drunk. And, I would feed them pieces of paper that this was said, this happened, so many dead, blah, blah, blah. And I felt that maybe I could become their equal. It was a secret wish of mine.
Who are some of the names that folks can go look up that were producing work that you really respected at the time? If folks are curious to actually go into the archives, who are some of the names that sort of jump out?
Doyle McManus of the LA Times, Joe Alex Morris, also of the LA Times, who eventually passed away, Jonathan Randall of the Washington Post, Lauren Jenkins. Of course, around you also had Robert Fisk. Eventually, Tom Friedman came, and he was one of the bureau chiefs at UPI, but I had left at that time, but we became very good and very chummy colleagues. There were John Kiffner of the New York Times, kind of an older generation of journalists. Of course, there were also British journalists, David Hurst.
No Arab journalists who were reporting for the foreign media aside you, essentially?
I think in the late 70s, Rami Khouri, who was an American citizen at the time, was stringing a little bit for the Washington Post. Eventually, Ibrahim, what's his name, the Egyptian, Yusuf Ibrahim, worked for the New York Times, but that came later onto my radar. And he was an Egyptian American who wrote for the New York Times. But I think I was the first woman. And I kind of was treated as an anomaly. But I think the fact that I held my ground and stayed with it eventually opened doors for other Arab women who worked for Reuters, Rula Khalaf of the Financial Times, many others, Hannah Allam, Suad Makhanet. There are so many Arab names now in the elite media. And it always makes me so proud to read them and to learn from them. And I even have a couple of students who have joined the Washington Post and the New York Times, and I'm immensely proud of them.
So I want to jump ahead. So after UPI, you decide to maybe I should go into academia. You start a grad school program, and you decide this is not for me. A PhD program, you decide this is not for me, although you're doing great. And then you decide to go back to Beirut because of, I believe, this moment. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Well, no. The sequence is slightly different.
Yeah, correct me.
I had been accepted for a doctoral program right after my master's, but I decided to go back to Beirut, and I worked at UPI. And then I got this letter saying, if you don't come next semester, your candidacy will be canceled. So I said, what the hell? I had saved enough money. I went for 1 semester, and I did really well. It was in Madison, Wisconsin, where the snow came up to my shoulder. And I was kind of bored because I was rereading the same books I had read as an undergrad. And my colleagues and my friends were going off to this was in 78, 79. My friends were going off to the front between Iraq and Iran, and I couldn't stand it. So I had 3 straight A's. The university offered me a full scholarship for my doctorate until I finished, and I turned it down, and I announced to my parents that I was coming back. And I couldn't get my old job back at UPI. They had filled it. At the time, Tom Friedman was the bureau chief, and he kind of tried to get me to come back, but there were office politics, etc. And I started just working a little bit for the Associated Press and for a news digest called the Middle East Reporter. And while I had worked at UPI during the night shift, I used to help correspondents from the Washington Post, the LA Times, the New York Times, who would fly in, who would parachute into Beirut, and they needed a quick briefing on what was going on. And I was always extremely generous and helpful and gave them quotes and phone numbers. Anyway, Jesse Jackson heads to Lebanon in August 1979 at the head of a delegation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Lord Fauntleroy and God knows who else. And since it was August, all the Washington Post correspondents were on holiday, and the Washington Post panicked. The now defunct Washington Star had a female or 2 reporters on the plane with Jesse Jackson. So I come home at night after a nice long dinner at a fancy restaurant with other correspondents, and it's midnight, there's no electricity, and my father is sitting in the living room waiting for me and saying, you had 3 phone calls from the Washington Post. They want a story on Jesse Jackson, who's staying at the Wiener Hotel, some street above the Commodore. And they want you to interview him and file a story from Reuters tonight. And I said, how am I going to get there? My father drove me. There was no electricity. We go into this rinky-dink lobby of the Wiener Hotel, and they had this phone box, and I dialed Jesse Jackson. I dialed his room, and I was writing on a Marlboro book. I had nothing. I was literally not prepared. And my father drops me off at Reuters. He said, take a cab back. And I filed my first story. And it was on the front page. And I had a byline, and it was, wow, the biggest high, for someone who's never been high, but it was high, a big high for me. And Jesse Jackson stayed in the region, in Lebanon, Jordan, etc., wanting to make peace on both sides of the River Jordan and to get hostage prisoners swapped. And so I followed him, just like any reporter would. I used to go follow him into the camps, etc. And on one of these tours of the camp, one of his men came up to me and said, hey, sister, you from the Post? I said, yes. He said, come with me. Kind of literally picked me up and planted me in front of Jesse Jackson, who had all my deadlines down pat. I didn't know what Washington Post deadline, and they would brief me ahead of every, they didn't have 24-hour news, they didn't have, but they had kind of early, I could file early in the evening. And that was it. And I got interviews, and we went to Arafat's home and had dinner with them. And it was an ongoing story. And then Jesse Jackson got very ill with food poisoning because of all this heavy, rich Palestinian food he was eating at Arafat's and Abu Iyad's homes. And I smuggled myself into the hospital, although no one was allowed to visit him. And the doctors thought I was my twin sister, who was a resident at the hospital then. So
that worked out well.
It worked out well for me. I cheated, and I went in to see Jesse Jackson, who was so upset that he was sick because he was trying to get prisoners released. And he said, "Have you ever been a prisoner?" And I said, "Only of my own conscience." And, we had this lovely, long conversation. And that was it. And on the last day he left, I felt it was the end of my life. What am I going to do? And David Hurst walked in. He said, "What's wrong with you? Why are you so glum?" I said, "Well, he's leaving." And it was said to me that this is just a one-shot deal.
Yeah.
And he said, no, that's not how it works. You have a foot in the door. Keep suggesting stories. And of course, the day he left, there was a Syrian-Israeli dogfight. And I suggested the story, and it got used. Yeah. And from then on, I kind of imposed myself. And the rest is history.
So I have more questions about Jesse Jackson, but I'm going to keep on going because there's a lot to cover. And then maybe if there's time at the end, you'll indulge me with another Jesse Jackson story. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the famous Hotel Commodore, which you've already alluded to, which in the 80s and 70s, or maybe just the 80s, was the hub for journalists in Hamra, in Ras Beirut, in East, what was then called West Beirut.
Yes.
Walk me through what this place was like.
It was kind of the dorm, the frat dorm for all these correspondents. Peter Jennings, all these big stars. Lally Weymouth, the daughter of Mrs. Graham. Everyone came there. And the staff cuddled them. They had 2 or 3 functioning telex lines, which was a boon. And they had good food. They had a Chinese restaurant. They had a parrot. They have an amazing circular bar where journalists kind of got sloshed every night after having filed their stories. And there was a lot of bonhomie, camaraderie, conviviality, joking around. There was a wonderful atmosphere. Of course, I was kind of a voyeur. I would go there to brief my correspondents, be they from the Financial Times or the Washington Post. I wasn't much of a drinker, never became one, but I kind of went in there, and I remember once referring to myself as a newspaper person. And John Kiffner turned to me, and this was after I had worked with them on so many stories. He said, "You're not a newspaper person, you're just one of the guys." And I said, okay, I'm being accepted into this fraternity, this collegiality of swashbuckling men who went to South Lebanon and went into the camps and interviewed Arafat. But that wasn't the only allure of the job. I was still a stringer. I was extremely badly paid. Yeah. But the opportunity I had to learn from these giants and to run around with them and interview people and see how they worked, how they pushed the limits, how they pushed the envelope. Sometimes I translated for them. Everyone said I was too generous with what I had, but it paid off. I learned from the greatest. And being a foreign correspondent then, being a journalist, had its very romantic mystique, and we had this sense of mission and devotion to the story and to the refugees we were encountering. We were kind of maybe the last witness to the tragedies that were befalling them, and we felt this compulsion to carry their story to the outside world. And it was a mixture of fun, it was challenging, it was kind of living through a concentrate of history and very intense experiences. But I learned so much. I beg your pardon?
Were there local journalists there as well? Was this a melting pot for local and foreign correspondents to meet and to share notes, or were you really the only Lebanese person there?
There were few local journalists. I know the networks, they all had local interpreters and fixers and drivers who kind of hung around. You know, they would. Okay. We didn't have iPhones, and there was maybe 1 or 2 ticker tapes by the elevators, but mostly we got our news from listening to the radio. Everyone was going around with the transistor radio, and they would kind of translate to their producers or the correspondents what was going on. So there were few, not many Arab correspondents who covered the wars the way we did, kind of going to every scene, going to every village. It was just, that's not the way they did it then.
Yeah. You mentioned Lauren Jenkins already, and you worked on the coverage of the massacre in Sabra and Shatila in '82,
yes,
which led to Lauren Jenkins' Pulitzer Prize.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like as somebody seeing this horrifying massacre up close?
Yes, we were, when the Israelis kind of, there was a multinational force, and there was tension between the multinational force and the Israeli army that was in and surrounding Beirut. And so the multinational force, they decided, it was Italian, French, and American, they decided to kind of vacate some of their positions. And Arafat had protested at the time, saying, my people are going to get massacred if you pull out as a peacekeeping force. And a lot happened then. There were hurried elections. Bashir Gemayel was elected. He was president-elect. And on August 14, there was a huge explosion at Phalange Party headquarters where he was chairing a meeting. And of course, he died late that night from his wounds. And on the next day, Ariel Sharon, who was defense minister, went to pay his condolences. Elias Sarkis had gone the night before. This was how I managed to confirm that he had died, because this was kind of kept under wraps for most of the day. What the Israelis told the leadership of the Phalange and Lebanese forces militias was, we have been in trouble with the Reagan administration for what has happened to the civilian population. And now there are all these terrorists still in the camp of Sabra and Shatila, and it is your job to go in and clean up the camps. They didn't tell them go massacre. But as many of the involved militia leaders described to me 10 years later, when I did an anniversary piece, they were full of rage, and they were really grieving for their leader, the person they had fought for, the person who was with them in the trenches. He had been assassinated, and eventually a force of Lebanese forces and the Elias Haddad, I don't think Haddad, the Haddad militia, which was a Lebanese militia composed of Shiites and Christians from South Lebanon under the leadership of a defected general from the army called Saad Haddad. But it was trained, equipped, paid by the Israelis. They converged on the camps and went in and started calling on residents to come out. And when families would come out, sometimes they separated the men and the women and they just shot them down. They mowed them down like rag dolls. There were at least 900, 1,000 people dead in Sabra and Shatila, and they weren't fighters. They were vegetable vendors, little craftsmen, and some women. When we caught wind of the fact that something was going on in the 3 days after the assassination of Bashir Gemayel, we would try to go close to the vicinity of the camps, and we couldn't. It was surrounded by Israeli soldiers on their stomachs, and at night we would see flares. And the Israelis were dropping flares so the militiamen could see what they were doing. And everyone at the Commodore had an inkling, a suspicion that someone was massacring in the camps. And it wasn't until a British nurse, Pauline Cutting, and some of her colleagues ran out of the camps, ran out of Burj Baraji and other camps and walked to the Commodore Hotel, and they briefed us at like 7 a.m. about what was happening. And I went in with Lauren Jenkins, Karsten Tveit from Norwegian television, Robert Fisk was with us, and eventually other journalists filtered in. Tom Friedman had by then started working for the New York Times. Lauren and I briefed him. I mean, this was big enough. There was no rivalry. The story had to go out. And some of the reports were sent out by taxi via Damascus. Some had to go through the Israeli censorship office in Yerzeh, but the story went out. And as we were walking around, and I had to go in with other journalists from the FT and from the London Observer. I was helping them. And so I had to see what was to be seen 3 times, but I didn't get to write the story at the time. It was it was a big story. It was the Correspondents who got to write it. And it was a very, very dark moment after the Israeli invasion of 1982, these massacres.
Was the local, did you see variance in the local coverage of it versus the international coverage of it?
You know, it was like such a sandstorm. If papers were coming out, I'm sure it was covered. But we were the ones who were going in and pushing for information. And I remember on one of the trips there, I had gone with Paul Edel from Reuters, and the Israelis had rounded up any young man they could find in West Beirut, or anyone who lived in the vicinity. And when I was there with Paul Edel, one of the Reuters Arabic service reporters, a Lebanese, stood up and raised his hand. He was so afraid he didn't dare speak. And Paul Edel claimed him and insisted that they let him free. And I mean, that was the one face I remember from that context.
I'm sure there'll be other questions in the chat afterwards about this, but I want to talk a little bit about later in the war and your coverage. At this point, you have your own byline, and there's this eerily similar story that was published in 1987 with the headline, "Devalued Currency Terrorizes Beirut." And so somebody who's living what's going on now and lived and reported on what was happening at the end of the 80s when the currency went from 3 lira to $1 to 3,000, and then later on back down to 1,500. Help us sort of understand the similarities and the differences between then and now.
Well, you know, overnight, the currency kind of dropped from 3 Lebanese pounds to the dollar, or 3.50 to the dollar, to 4,500 to the dollar. And then it went down and stabilized. And overnight, if you had Lebanese savings, they were worth nothing in dollars. Say you were a student saving to go and study overseas. I had a friend who went to Parsons to study design, and her father was sending her from her savings piecemeal, and all of a sudden it was worth nothing. And she had 3 jobs in New York to fund her studies. She even worked as a super in her own building. I mean, that's what it was like. Here, people were frantic, and we saw this transition from having a Lebanese currency to becoming a heavily dollarized Lebanese economy. All of a sudden, everything was in dollars. You went to buy something, you want to buy a dress, everything was in dollars. I remember there was a dress that I had been eyeing at the time that was, I don't know, 4,500 Lebanese pounds, and I paid $1 for it. French designer. It was insane, kind of the sudden drop in the value of the Lebanese pound. But although it was a kind of watershed moment for the Lebanese economy and for the Lebanese, we didn't have the banking crisis that we have now. People didn't have their money hijacked by the banks that they trusted to safeguard their lifetime savings. It's difficult to draw parallels, but the world turned upside down. Militiamen were selling their guns, and that's when we started seeing people kind of diving into huge trash bins looking for food, and it was a little bit out of control, but the central bank was very strong and healthy at the time. People had the confidence that the Lebanese government had gold at Fort Knox. There wasn't the total collapse in trust and confidence that you have now. Sorry.
So before we get to some of the work that you did after you come back, the last question I want to ask about your time during the war was some of your coverage in April of 1987. There was a moment at a Palestinian refugee camp in Beirut where you sneak into this camp to do some reporting, and you've won awards based off this, this reporting. Can you talk a little bit about what that moment was like and what you were reporting on?
Sure. It was, one of the many maneuvers. The Syrians, who were by then heavily deployed inside Beirut, decided to kind of redeploy, kind of disengage from around the camps, and they put the Shiite Amal militia in charge of the surroundings of the camps. And the camps were under siege for like 3 or 4 months, and reports were filtering into Beirut. And at the time, there was so-called stability. The Syrians were around, yet not around. The Blue Note had just launched its opening on McHool Street. There was the back street. There were pubs and restaurants. And, it was really eerie to think that less than 2 miles away, there were these civilians under siege, and we began hearing stories about starvation and writing stories about starvation. And so the militiamen around the camp would allow the women every Friday afternoon to leave the camp and to do some grocery shopping, and to get to the shopping area where they had like vegetable push carts and produce vendors. They had to walk across a wasteland that was about 200 to 300 meters at the most. And for fun, the militiamen would snipe at them. And by the time the 19th woman was dead, Marie Colvin and I, the late Marie Colvin and I, sitting at the Blue Note, decided that this is something we have to cover. We can't let this go on. So she went in on her own with her driver into the camp. And there, I don't want to get into what Marie did, but I had to convince my editors that this was a story that we had to cover. And they were nervous. And I said, look, one of your correspondents left a little bullet vest behind. It was a tiny white bullet vest. And what was written on it was last chance. I said, look, as a compromise, I'll wear this bullet vest under my clothes. And I went in dressed in shabby long clothes, pretending to be a refugee woman. And I lined up with the women as they, carrying their groceries. They were getting ready to walk across this wasteland covered with reddish sand. And I told the woman, let me help you. I carried oil, I carried eggs, and I had little notebooks stuffed inside my sweater. And as we came in, of course, they shot at the women. I can't remember if someone was killed that day. I can't remember. But one of the militia, one of the Amal militia women or girls who did a body search, she said, what are all these notebooks? And they had little flowers on them. I had bought them from a grocery store. And I said, I'm getting these for my niece so she can have something to do. And that's it. And I went in. I had established contact with a hospital there through one of the Palestinian factions. And I planned to spend the night there. So I could spend at least 24 hours or more reporting on what was actually happening. And as soon as we walked in, some of the women from fright, they started throwing up. Some of the little girls started crying. And I latched on to a couple of children, and I said, please lead me to that hospital. And they did, and there was Pauline Cutting, the British nurse, who had alerted us to the Sabra and Shatila massacres. There was, I think, a Norwegian male nurse, there was a British nurse, and other Palestinian doctors. And there was not a person in that camp who was not on crutches. And I interviewed, until I collapsed from fatigue, interviewed women, I interviewed men who were recovering, I interviewed these two girls who would be sent out from the other end of the camp and jump over from a high ledge to go get medical supplies. I mean, these were the real heroines. They were like, 10 or 11 years old. And I think the Norwegian nurse gave me a couple of rolls of film that, again, I pushed into my vest. And I walked back. I had agreed with a driver to come and collect me late Saturday afternoon. And that's what I did. I didn't tell any of my colleagues or my friends that I was doing that. And I came out and I wrote the story. And although you're never supposed to start a story with a quote, I couldn't get out of my mind this old Palestinian woman who rolled her tea leaves to smoke because there were no cigarettes. And she said, with every mouthful of food, there were buckets of blood. Because this for me kind of crystallized what these women were going through to feed their families, taking this great personal risk of maybe getting shot. And I wrote the story, and it was a finalist for. I was still a stringer then. I was a lowly stringer, and it was unheard of. I wasn't an American citizen then, and the story was nominated, but I didn't get it, obviously, but it was a huge honor to be a finalist, to be nominated. And then, the Post kind of eventually started taking me very seriously, and it took them 8 years to put me on the staff after I kicked up a big fuss, but then they put me on the staff after that. In 1988, I became a member of the staff.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to run out of time, and there's so much to talk about. Maybe we'll have to do some sort of follow up at some point. But I want to talk a little bit about 2000, and you come back, and after the war has ended. It's been over a decade since the war. There's a quote that you have online: "I want to be optimistic, and this is an auspicious time for Lebanon." This is in 2000. "The dust has settled from all the battles and the blood. The future is going to be more difficult than surviving the war. Now we have to look inside ourselves." Where are we now?
We're still looking inside ourselves. As you well know, and most of the listeners know, that we had so-called uprising in 2019, and it failed. But what it succeeded at was to kind of bring that introspection out into the open. There was the level of awareness rose during that time about how these politicians, to pad their own pockets after they had acted with impunity and been rewarded for it by becoming ministers and members of parliament after the Ta'if conference, which ended the civil war, how they were exploiting differences and divisions to remain in power and to keep stealing us blind. So I think we're still in a phase of introspection and reflection and extreme disgust. I don't think that anything will come to fruition before this nation can prove at the ballot box next May that it can bring about change. Whether change will happen is anybody's guess. But this is our only hope. And right now we are in crisis management mode.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to open up the questions. I have a whole set of questions that I had for you about the current state of media, but I don't think we're going to get to them. So maybe we can get to have a follow-up in a few months or something like that and talk about media more broadly. But we're going to open up to questions. I'm going to ask every single person to unmute themselves. So we'll start with Rose. Rose, if you'd like to put on your camera, you're more than welcome. Go ahead, Rose.
Nora, thank you so much. It's such an honor to hear you. I have always admired your work. I think your stories had the ring of truth, accuracy, and humanity. Could you comment on U.S. current reporting on the Middle East and North Africa? And also, did you know Helen Thomas? Thank you.
Yes, to start with the end of your question, yes, I knew Helen Thomas very well, and I had the honor of introducing her at one of Jim Zugby's big gala events in Washington. And it's very sad how her career ended, but I don't think anyone will forget how phenomenal she was and what an institution she was, poking the eye of every president about policy in the Middle East. To go back to where we are in terms of the coverage of the Middle East and North Africa, I think it's better when the world is focused on it. Of course, COVID has complicated travel and access. The war in Syria was very difficult to cover because of visas and because people had to kind of smuggle themselves into the country. And we saw the proliferation of citizen journalism in countries like Syria, where we would talk to people or journalists covering the story for the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Sunday Times would interview people on Skype. Social media helped. And I think there has been a very serious effort to kind of bring out the voice of people in the region. After the 2003 war and the basis on which it was fought and so many lives lost, there was a reckoning in the American media and by American readers and by policymakers and even columnists who had been kind of swept away in the rhetoric of war, that we were, as media outlets, we were led by the nose, and we had a lot of sand thrown into our eyes. And there was a much greater effort to focus on suffering and child labor and women trafficking and rape and all these unsavory issues. And there was there have been some amazing reports about the trials of certain Syrians in Europe recently as well. The word, the term crimes against humanity is taken much more seriously than it was a decade or so ago. So the coverage has improved when it is there, when there is space and when the attention of the editors is properly focused.
Great question. Thanks, Rose. Annalise, you're up.
Hi, sorry about that. I think my question was a little bit premature. I lived in Beirut for a couple of years, and I happened to meet Terry Anderson in a bar, and he introduced me to Robert Fisk. So I was very lucky to meet both Terry and Robert for dinner. And I just wanted to say that while we were in the car after the dinner, he was called to the front about that incident, I don't know, about 10 years ago, where there was the tree trimming and they had an altercation, whatever. And I almost went there with him or something like that. And I just wanted to, your experience with people like Robert Fisk, like his opinions or his points of view. He actually took me to Sabra and Shatila. So I just wanted what you thought of his point of view.
That's not a very comfortable question to ask of a colleague who has recently passed away. Robert Fisk was a prolific correspondent. He went everywhere. He bent the rules sometimes. He saw things that we didn't see, but he had a tremendous following, was a good writer, wrote a couple of books on the Middle East. I didn't always see eye to eye. I think his heart was in the right place. British journalism is a little different from the American approach to factual journalism that, you can stand up and defend. No one ever interrogated Fisk about every element in his stories. I mean, I once worked together with him on a story about illegal ports. And I took him with me on a trip. We visited several illegal ports, and it was a very interesting story. And I wrote my story. It was for AP at the time. And he wrote his story, and his story had a body bleeding on one of the streets we had driven through, and it wasn't there. But he liked to embellish sometimes and dramatize, but he was a legend. I mean, there wasn't a place he didn't go, and he had tremendous energy and a big heart, and was driven by this nervous compulsion to be everywhere at once. And may he rest in peace. That's all I can say.
Thanks, Annalise. Okay, we're going to end up with the last question from Alan, and then we're going to wrap up.
Hi, Nora. The question for you is, do you still submit from time to time hard news pieces to the Post, or are you fully retired from that and but spending your time in the university? And the other thing is, listening to you go through, what you've said over the past few minutes, I can't help but think there's a book here somehow. Maybe Lebanon then and now, but you said you were a storyteller as a young individual in the beginning of your career. And maybe as you approach the end of your career and look at your life as a whole, I'm just wondering if there's a final story for you to tell.
When the Washington Post asks me for a specific piece, I do it, and it's somewhere, it's hard news reporting, but usually kind of a much deeper perspective than just your superficial news story. I've contributed to a column they had over the years about women and women's issues. I would like to go back and write well-reported opinion pieces. I have been fully invested these last few years, these last 10 years, in doing all my storytelling in class to inspire my students. What my most important legacy now is to kind of build an army of little Noras that will kind of grow up and go out in the world and do fantastic work. I would like to reflect on all the things that have happened and write about them more. But when you've done the kind of coverage that I've done and gone from being a local Lebanese girl to being a member of the staff in Washington with all the challenges and the politics and the rivalry, I feel immensely tired, and I kind of need the psychic space to experience some tranquility, which unfortunately has been in short supply in Lebanon these days. But I promise you I'll get back to writing. Right now, I'm totally focused on teaching.
Thank you, Nora.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for your questions.
Okay, everybody, we've hit the hour. Thank you so much for joining. This was a really amazing talk, Nora. I think we could talk for another couple hours. It's an honor that you've joined us and shared your perspective. So thanks so much for that.
Thank you. It was lovely to kind of reminisce and relive the exciting part of my life that is over, but I'm glad I am where I am right now. But thank you.
If anyone's interested in connecting with Nora, she's very easy to find online. Just search Nora Boustany and you will find her contact information. You can look up all these stories. They are all online. This recording will go on our YouTube page and on our podcast in a couple of days. Please share it with your friends who may have missed today's episode. Okay, everybody, have a good day or night wherever you are, and we will see you on Thursday. We have another event. Okay, everybody.
Thank you, afikra. Great idea, afikra.
Thanks, Nora.